Welcome and good evening for tonight's lecture. 2 weeks ago, we started launching our ongoing series on collaborations with Michael Osman, and we are very delighted to continue it with you, Katherine Clarke, from MAF Architects, Architecture and Art London, and with the beautiful title, Purity and Tolerance, Reflections on 30 Years in Practice. And before I hand over to our two moderators, Amelie and Mia Zink, students from the bachelor's program, I just would like to share one thought. Only one small thought, because I realized that meanwhile this term on collaboration somehow sounded a little bit like an earworm by now, since we are talking already about it since about a year. And I had to remind myself, and maybe that's also good for us, that collaborations are really not given. They are kind of art for itself, and we're going to listen to it probably later in your lecture. And that we have to renegotiate it, what it actually means, even though we are doing it every day, whether we want it or not. But I think we really have to remind ourselves it's not a standard recipe behind. And I think MAF is a really good example also to learn from, because they are experts on collaborations, but not only on that, they are also experts on urban planning and also approaches on process-oriented approaches, and also that both are not separable. So in no way.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to introduce our guest, Katherine Clarke. I think Heike already did it, kind of, but welcome. We are very happy to have you here with us tonight.
Katherine is an artist and the co-founder of the collaborative practice MAF Architecture and Art, which is based in London. The office was established in 1995 together with her partner Lisa Fior, who is an architect. And what we think is very interesting, that it has never had less than 80% female members. MAF works between art and architecture with a strong focus on public spaces. The main goal is developing projects that allow more than one thing to happen at the same time and that respond to people who already live there.
Yes, the practice has received national but also international recognition, including the European Prize of Public Space or the RIBA London Award in 2025. And the practice also is working a lot with cultural institutions, but also with cities within the UK and also with international cities abroad. Their work has also been presented at the Venice Architecture Biennale, where they were responsible for the British pavilion in 2010. And now we are looking forward to hearing more about your work and the ideas behind MAF. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and just to say how wonderful your city is, especially in the sun. It was just delightful to arrive here from, slightly less gloomy London. And thank you for the introduction. I feel like you've done kind of the heavy lifting of the beginning of the lecture for me. Thank you. Yeah, so this lecture is a reflection on 30 years in practice and 30 years of struggling to understand what collaboration is. And those collaborations have both been within the practice between Liza and I and Juliette Bidgood, who was another one of the founding partners with Cass Schonfield, and with people that we've worked with inside the practice, also working with other expertise outside the practice, and then collaborating or co-designing with end users to understand the nature of a site and to bring accuracy to our proposals. So I wanted to start the lecture with an event that happened 30 years ago when we were barely even a practice, and the Architecture Foundation in London started a series called Public Views, which were exhibitions in the basement of the Smithson's Economist building, with the intention to showcase emerging architects and innovative practice and make architecture more accessible through public-focused events. So as I said, we barely existed at the time. We submitted a very, very slim portfolio and were invited by the then director, Ricky Burdett, to take over the exhibition space. And upon being invited, we then had to kind of reflect what it means to practice and to understand that everyone practices within their own historical context. And ours at the time was intersectional feminism, which across the four of us, we didn't necessarily have a kind of definitive description of what that meant. The socio-economic critique of conceptual art practice, which had informed very much both Liza and I's practice. The political environment, which was Thatcher, Reagan, no such thing as society, and early motherhood. Liza had just had a child. And we were practicing at a time where Thatcher had declared that there was no such thing as society, and so as a consequence there was no such thing as public space. And we made this agreement between ourselves that was articulated and kind of deeply felt individually, that we didn't want to have private clients. We wanted to make social space, we wanted to make public space. And so we kind of came to this exhibition invitation with a kind of galvanizing, disruptive rage of kind of the position that we came to. And we felt like we'd been finally invited to the feast. And the ensuing conversations between the four of us, Liza, Juliet, Kath and I, were resolved as what was then a kind of experiential space. Go on to the next one. An experiential space that somehow kind of held the concept of what it takes to make kind of space for the fragile temporal qualities of the personal, and to make the kind of political robust and public and available. And Juliet led us. Juliet was the kind of instigator of the use of this material resolution, which brought this elegant conceptual purity of the imminent compromise of the kind of shiny white taut latex ceiling, precariously bulging with a latex, with a volume of water that it held back. Liza framed the space as a methodology where the personal meets the political. What does it take to include more than one fragile thing at a time? And what if the brief is a room? And who is invited in? Who sits at the decision-making table? I simply filmed the inside of Liza's fridge, the grout between her bathroom tiles, the compromised white surfaces of the everyday, joyfully embracing Brian O'Doherty's ideology of the white cube gallery space, which had been a major kind of influence on the four of us, that idea of the modernist white space and what that excludes and what it includes. Kath bought a punk feminist riff on Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger, and she wrote her manifesto on the windows, which you can just see reflected back. And her meaning that she articulated leaked between ideas and things, and she made the association between modernist building, cladding and sanitary products, both designed to protect against seepage. The subtext being a critique of who sets the rules of the games to identify and exclude the polluting other. Ironically, during the install, the industrial blow heaters used to heat and soften the latex to its maximum pliability so we could stretch it across the space, activated the foundation sprinkler system, and in a farcical realisation of the metaphor, water poured into the foundation officers while a visibly harassed but endlessly tolerant and charming director, Ricky Burdett, frantically mopped and prevented the computers from being drowned. I will just let this run through to the end. And so that's the Brian O'Doherty's Inside the White Cube, which is a series of essays that kind of analyse the kind of political structure that's made within the White Cube gallery space, and how the framing of art isn't simply an aesthetic act, it's one of a political construct. And this is the Economist building here, which you can see it's this very rigorous, modernist, kind of clean line building. And this is the basement space where we installed the latex. And we enjoyed this conceit of bringing into that very kind of rigorous, modernist building, this kind of other geometry. Kind of in the preparation of this lecture, as one often does, I made good use of the deadline inertia and frittered away a lot of time in the Archives of Destruction. I don't know if any of you have come across it. It's Jess Fernie's amazingly beautiful compendium, which is a eulogy to destroyed, damaged and erased public works of art. And I finally kind of came aground on Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which was this very uncompromising sculpture that was installed in New York's Federal Plaza, and to incredibly kind of reactive response. And in 1988, 8 years after it was installed, it was cut down and removed. And the government became the arbiters of whether it should stay or go. And they triumphed in this £30 million court case, where they pitted the kind of the structure of the court case deliberately pitted workers against artists and artists against artists in what was framed as a false choice between you can either have deck chairs in the plaza, or you can have picnic tables, or you can have art. And so that optimism of an open-ended kind of speculation, which in a way I think is what Serra's work does. It insists that we kind of come to that space and we speculate on what it is to be in public space and who we are. But that was closed down by making this kind of false distinction between you can either have picnic tables or you can have art. You can't have both things. It's either this or that. And so my afternoon in the archive led me to think about MUFS projects and which ones would be included, which ones had kind of suffered that kind of being destroyed or damaged or erased, and kind of came up with a list of them. That's not to say that kind of every public realm project ends in disaster, but I think there is a kind of an issue around kind of when one designs something and gives over to the end users and to the people who are to care for it, who didn't necessarily start off with the same idea that you did, and then what happens during the kind of the public life of that project. So this is Barking Square, which was awarded the European Prize for Urban Public Space in 2000. I can't remember what the date was, 2013, I think. And it was a kind of incredibly sort of generous space, planting an arboretum of mature trees in between the housing blocks, and kind of returning back to this kind of space, some of the dignity of it being the major public space in Barking. And it was full of places to sit and planting. But 15 years after completion, when we went to visit the other day, all of the understory planting had been replaced with resin bound and the benches removed because of a concern that homeless and street drinkers were sleeping on them. Though the open-ended invitation of the stage, which is opposite the town hall and completely mimics, you can see the people sitting on it up there, and it completely mimics the kind of the grandeur of the municipality of the town hall steps opposite has remained because it's not considered to be public seating. The local authority had no money and no capacity or resources to explore an alternative to removing what they can't care for. And so how do we generate the energy to explore this further? For example, where do the homeless go when there are limited support structures? And should all capital projects come with a revenue, not just for maintenance, but for how life can be lived? So, for example, in the UK, there's an experiment giving small, unconditional cash grants to homeless individuals, which is shown to be more effective, leading to better housing stability and not increased spending on drugs and alcohol. So that correlation between the capital spending and making a public space and how then the public inhabit that space are so interrelated, and yet they are so separated in terms of both how they're cared for and the revenue that's put into their aftercare. This is Altab Ali Park in Whitechapel. These are the before pictures on the top, and then this is the proposal that we made. The park at first sight was simply a patch of grass on a busy street. used predominantly by groups of young men who would congregate on the play equipment because there was nowhere to sit. But on closer looking, it had multiple identities. It had been the site of 4 churches since the Middle Ages, built over, demolished and bombed. And it was named Altab Ali after a garment worker who was killed by racists in the park. And in the corner on the slide on the top left is the Shahid Munir Memorial to those who fought for the Bengali language. And so it was this sort of microcosm of layering of histories and cultures that came to share this space. And to understand the space, or the site, at the speed of its occupation, we secured funding for a public archaeological dig in partnership with the Museum of London. And that process enabled us to spend a summer on the site and to observe how it was used and who it was used by. And we engaged over 1,000 local people, including children and street drinkers, who came and took part in the dig. And as part of the process of the dig, we not only extracted the artefacts out the ground, which are shown on the bottom here, but we asked the people who are in the park to give something that was of no monetary value but had, significance for them in their lives, private significance. And we added that to the finds table. So somebody gave the tablets they take, and they put on the label, "I take these to keep you sane." And so it's that idea that a history of a place isn't just made up by the kind of grand gestures, but it's made up by the kind of tiny everyday incidents of people's lives. And the scheme kind of brings together this sense of kind of the past and the present, and it uses that historical references to the ecclesiastical furniture to make these social spaces where people can congregate, and makes very open-ended social spaces, many different places to sit that enable kind of different groupings of different people to use the park. And there's a sort of ambiguity about whether these are places to sit or whether these are places to play. And this is this long kind of walkway, seating way, traces the footprint of the church and makes again like this extended social space. And the tracing of the invisible churches that have been destroyed make this walkway along the edge of the park. So you can be walking along the street, you can enter the park and continue your walk. So you can be both on the street and in the park at the same time. And in 2014, after it had been finished, I was kind of hanging around, as one does in your projects, to kind of see how they're being used. And I was confronted by an incredibly angry youth worker, incensed by the design. And his nuanced reading of the level difference between the elevated walkway and the pavement was that it created, it baked in the infrastructure for violence. The elevated vantage of the park, he thought, invited young people to take an aggressively dominant position on his peers. And I was struck by his energetic and uncompromising vision, and was thinking, what would it take to co-client with someone like that, to take on board his nuanced reading of public space? How would that difference sit at the design table and not be tidied away or ignored? And that kind of sense and his spirit came back to haunt me in this next project, which was for White Hart Lane in Tottenham. And the original brief here was to kind of renovate and regenerate the road that led from the station to the new stadium, which was in a kind of very poor state of repair, and to instigate the idea of modal change, to encourage people to cycle and to walk, and to diminish the space for cars. And so you can see on the sections at the top, when the original street has 6 lanes of traffic on it, double parking and 2 lanes of traffic. And then in the scheme that we made, we reduced the width of the road down to 3.80 meters, and had room for 2 rows of traffic, extended the pavement and tilted the road, so the road is engineered to slope from one side to the other, so the water drains to the sunny side of the street, which all has permeable paving and rain gardens, and makes a social space to sit. And this is the finished scheme, and the rain gardens make a kind of buffer to the road, and they also make these places to sit on the edge of the curbs. This, at the time, was a really progressive scheme. It was the first full SUD scheme to be delivered, and it sought to impact the impact of the climate emergency, and particularly in White Hart Lane, which had very, very bad downstream flooding, and to make these social spaces and kind of shift that focus from traffic to a street for people, and also to accommodate the people walking down the street to the Tottenham Stadium at the end of the road. So when the design was completed, and it was realised in partnership with this incredibly progressive and ambitious engineer from the council called Peter Watson, and with Robert Bray Associates, who are SUDS experts, and with Decker, who did the lighting. And the rain garden edges on completion, as intended, acted as social spaces. It was spaces where people sat and became social spaces outside the shops, where people would gather and where children would play running along the curbs. And flooding incidents were dramatically reduced, and the narrowing of the road had no impact on the times of the buses, which was one of the anxieties of Transport for London when we were designing the scheme. However, again with this scheme, the maintenance of the rain gardens was a problem right from the beginning, because the council was insufficiently foresighted to realise that they would need to maintain them. There was somehow this kind of rather bizarre belief that planting is self-sustaining. And despite our continual return to the scheme to weed it, it became very overrun with weeds. But maintenance of the rain gardens was one ongoing issue, and there were events far outside the original brief which would have catastrophic impact on the rain gardens. So in London between 2017 and 2021, Sian Berry from the Green Party, as part of the London Assembly, had published 5 reports detailing budget cuts of 36 million to the London Youth Service care and support, including the loss of 600 full-time youth workers. And in 2021, the number of London-wide violent teenage deaths were at the highest they'd been since 2008. And one of those 30 deaths, sadly, was in a road adjacent to White Hart Lane, where 2 sixth form students planned an attack after a perceived slight and hid zombie knives, possibly in one of the rain gardens, and then returned to collect them and fatally stabbed someone who was trying to break up the altercation. Subsequent to that, in 2024, the government published the multi-agency response to serious youth violence and advocated a multilateral public health approach focused on partnership working to identify children in need and enable them to access care and support. Effectively, what they did was reinstate a working approach that had been systematically dismantled over the previous years. But sadly, the rain gardens became a victim of that sense of how to kind of address this issue. And in 2025, with minimal consultation, the youth support team removed all the rain garden planting on White Hart Lane and left them as kind of shallow graves in some ironic way. And it led us to the conclusion that sometimes, just as a built thing isn't always the answer, the opposite can also be true. The built isn't always the problem. It's a both and thing, and this kind of strange sort of failure of design and failure of occupation that I saw at Gatwick the other day kind of articulates that conundrum of kind of that gap between the built and the lived. In writing this talk, Liza and I were having a conversation about what do we hold dear. And that's a kind of very hard thing to answer as a designer. What are the things that motivate you? And I suppose what I was able to kind of identify, the things that I care about, is creating the conditions of nurture and the conditions for open-ended speculative creativity. And in this slide on the left-hand side was cataloguing we made of trees in wood green as part of writing a design manual for care and repair, where there's over 100 trees that are planted in compromised positions, and then made a detailed analysis of how the conditions could be improved for them. And on the this side of the scheme, the slide is an image from Art Camp, which was a programme that MUF devised and delivered as part of the Olympic Park legacy. And this is a kind of short film.
Well, at art camp we saw like we made a horror story, and it's like we had to make up the theme ourselves, yeah. And I think our one was about a horror chef or something like that, and he had to he tried killing everyone with poison and all that in his food, and then he turned the humans into monsters, and you can't really do that in school.
We learnt how to make things, and me, Lauren and Peter made a table, and we made a horror film which was really good.
Art camp is different to learning because if you want to do something, you can. And if you was in school, the teachers say, no, you can't do this because it's dangerous and you might cut yourself or something. But at club, they let you actually have a go. You've never actually hammered. Art camp actually tells you you can have a go by yourself, and we could make our own chairs and everything.
Like when you're at the warehouse, you just make what you want and then like use the space like how you want to use it.
And I got to like express myself with the stuff I made.
Now that we're in school, like I'm always looking forward to doing art because like it's now that I've gone to art camp, it's like taught me how to have confidence in my art and told me like how to express myself.
Oh, that was amazing because I got to like see stuff that I'd never saw before.
I saw this really disgusting thing, and it was like babies. So like it was like the babies getting older and older, but they died inside their mum.
Having my artwork on show was really like, it made me feel proud and happy in myself, because like having other people come in and like be inspired by our work. Yeah, like they was asking like, what have you been doing, and some people wanted to buy some of the photos.
Well, I feel quite special that I got my things like out so people can see.
It was so fun at art camp, and if we do get to use that warehouse again, I want to put my stamp on it so then we can use it all the time. Oh, and also we got to stop them from breaking it down.
Working with artists is like when they inspire their imaginations and all that crazy art stuff.
The art camp was set in a neighbourhood next to the Olympic site, which was a series of post-industrial 19th century warehouses that had become artist studios. And it was very apparent that the kind of white heat of development that would be brought to Hackney Wick with the development of the Olympic Park, which at the time was just industrial wasteland, would make it unaffordable for those artists to carry on practicing there. And the question that we asked ourselves was kind of twofold, was how can you genuinely make a mixed-use neighbourhood? And part of the commission was to write the planning guidance, and it became very obvious that that tension between making space for artists and making affordable housing was a circle that couldn't be squared. And the other question was then, where does the next generation of artists come from if you don't have that low-cost type of neighbourhood where they can appropriate space and appropriate kind of the public realm to turn that into their space of exhibition? And the warehouses that were used in Art Camp were subsequently developed as kind of mixed use with some artist studios were retained at ground floor, but again the cost of maintaining them as studios was very, very high, so they were let as shells, and so they were unaffordable for artists to move in and start practicing. So that kind of conundrum between kind of development and culture was really evident in this project. And in some ways, kind of Art Camp was a memento mori. It was a way of kind of bringing the spotlight to something that we knew was going to die, and by doing so, kind of accentuating what it means to kind of operate as an architect or an artist in those environments where inevitably one becomes part of that process of erasure. And in this last project that I want to talk about, which is Ruskin Square, which again was how does one position yourself in relation to working for a developer. Our commission was to design the public realm between the buildings on this very large site in Croydon. And the development site was called Ruskin, after John Ruskin. It was Ruskin Square after John Ruskin, who had lived in Croydon at some point. And we kind of provocatively took John Ruskin's philosophy. He was a philanthropist and a teacher with a real belief in the idea of kind of craft and the handmade and the beauty of nature and the kind of the political economy and cooperation and social theory. How can we embed that in each stage of the project in order that we could continue to hold the kind of developer to account? And so the development was very large and it was phased. So at each phase of the development, we enacted these temporary occupations of the space. So on the left-hand side of the slide here is before the site was touched at all, while it was still a kind of brownfield site and quite wild. And we made a relationship with the Refugee Council, who operate in Croydon, and with local young artists in Croydon, and commissioned the young artists to run a series of close-looking drawing workshops with children. And we invited them onto the site and made the site into a wildlife garden. And within that wildlife garden, we built a series of cricket nets that were then shared between the young Afghani men who were living in Croydon through the Refugee Council, and with office workers who were occupying the offices around. And so it was a way of sort of socially engineering the future users of the site and inviting them into the site before it was finished. And this was the first phase of the development, which again kind of referenced back to John Ruskin's kind of belief in nature and geology, and kind of giving real kind of close looking at geology. And so we used natural stone to create this sort of a kind of design of a mountain that was a social space and a play space, and brought some kind of wilderness into this very, very kind of particular manicured space. And we then used that space for the next kind of temporary inaction, which was to test another one of John Ruskin's idea, was the idea that the highest reward for your toil is not what you get for it, but what you become by it. And so that idea of kind of that close engagement with your hands, kind of with the world around you, and kind of fabricating natural resources into products was something we wanted to explore. And again, working through the Refugee Council, we worked with a group of young men who had leave to remain but hadn't yet entered into employment. And it was a way of kind of giving them that kind of soft entry into work, because the kind of the process that people go through when they're waiting to become able to live in Britain is very, very isolating, and that expectation that one can just leave and go straight back into life was simply kind of impossible to imagine. And so we worked with 4 young men, and over a period of 4 months, I think it was, we worked with them to dig clay out of the empty development site and make a clay oven, and actually use the clay to make vessels. We took the waste aluminium and made a furnace and smelted that on site, and made the cutlery, and the cutlery and the vessels and the clay oven were used to cook this this dinner, which invited sorry, if I go back to this slide here. So the bottom two slides is the dinner where we invited the young men hosted this dinner, invited the developer and decision-making people from the council to come and have that conversation. So they took a place at the table and were able to have a place in that conversation about the future of the city and what it should look like. And then again, this sort of act of collaboration with these young people was a way of kind of showcasing their capacity to kind of be in the public realm and to actually be productive. And it was a way of kind of performing occupation. And on this slide here, there's a group of school children who were on their way to the station who stopped to see what was going on. And this is the last slide from Ruskin, and again it goes back to that idea of kind of caring and nurturing nature as well as making space for people kind of to take their place within this environment. And when this is the site just at the beginning of the development, and at the top you can see there's a mature tree which was originally on the other side of the hoarding, but when the developer extended their ownership of the land, what was a street tree fell into private ownership. And initially they'd wanted to cut it down, but as the public realm designers, we made this argument for keeping it because of the value of mature trees in the way that they kind of improve the environment in so many ways. And it had been planted incredibly brutally into this concrete collar. And so the first act was to kind of release the tree from its torment and air spade all around it to decompact the roots and then to give it a kind of much more healthy environment to flourish in. And the square itself, you can see the footprint of it laid out on the left-hand side, which again drew very deliberately on Ruskin's philanthropic acts of making reading rooms, which is the image below, 19th century reading rooms for working men. So that way of making the infrastructure for people who were kind of within the sort of emerging kind of industrialization to still have time to kind of retreat into themselves and better themselves, to kind of find out who they were rather than just becoming kind of tools of that industrialization process. And this is the square on completion, and you can see there the kind of the oval reading room with seating round the outside with kind of seats at the scale of the adult and seats at the scale of the child to make this deliberate invitation, and with the planting making this sort of oasis which eventually the square will sit with high office blocks on each side, so it makes this like oasis for people to come from the office and to have that kind of moment of retreat in the square. And I want to end with a series of kind of diagrams that we made at MUF to try and describe our process of working. And so this is what happens in every project where we have this optimistic moment of being commissioned, and then we take the brief and we have to have that process which kind of you're all familiar with, of kind of like internalizing the site, understanding the potential of the site. And the client's level of anxiety while you're going through that internal process kind of rises exponentially until one starts producing designs, and then their anxiety falls away. And so learning how to kind of manage that trajectory is something that we've never quite been able to do. There's that sense of sort of holding them in this sort of holding place of saying it will be all right, we will produce, but we need to know first, we need to know what we're dealing with. And then this idea that the brief itself is a room, and how do you then crowd the room to refine that brief? And that's the idea of who do you bring into the project, and bringing in those end users to the project, the people who are going to actually occupy the public space, and understanding them and their lives and what they're going to bring to the things that you make. And then once you've conceptualized the brief as the room, how do you kind of wedge the door open to allow others to come in and to join that conversation to continually expand the brief? And this diagram explains to some extent, I think, our methodology, which is always that sense of you go to a place And the first thing you have to do is that close looking, that spending time on site. And when you two came in and you were talking about that, going through that analysis, that kind of really valuable moments of understanding what you're looking at and understanding where the value is, because the value that you see in it is not necessarily going to be the same as the value of the people who occupy that space. And then once you've identified what the value is, how can you nurture it? How can you turn that those kind of very fragile, valuable things into bigger possibilities? And how do you then define what's missing? What is the thing that you then bring to that process? And in every public project, there's always that relationship as described in the first diagram with the client, particularly when you're working in public space that's problematic in some way, because the client is not necessarily the end user. They may be kind of paying the invoices, but they're not the person who's going to come and occupy the place that you're making. And so there's a kind of a struggle there between who you're designing for, and that sense of always kind of building for yourself an imaginary line, which is the line of compromise, which you're not going to go below. And so always being kind of confident enough to interrogate the brief and to dismantle the brief to a point where you can see all the component parts and you understand through a kind of accurate knowledge who the end users are going to be, how you can kind of put it back together in order that the acts that you make are a contribution to the public realm, and it's not merely one being complicit with the client and what they feel is needed, because if they kind of knew what was needed, they'd just make it themselves. They wouldn't invite you into that relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting to listen to. Now we would like to give the word to the audience. If you have any question, now it's the time.
Thank you. I thought your last diagram with the complicity and the contribution is a very beautiful diagram. We're also talking about that in the bachelor thesis here, that we value the things that are here and we're not trying to bring the beautiful world to the people and then destroying things that are already there. So I have the question about your clients. Who are your clients? Are they private clients or is it the city?
It's a combination of the city and developers who are making developments where there is public space or where there's what's called public space. It's very often privatized public space, but it's still termed public space. And I think the situation more and more in the UK and especially in London is that councils can't afford to develop. They don't have any money, so they have to make these development vehicles with private organisations in order to deliver. Some councils do it better than others, where they retain status as client, and so they can have the end say. But there still becomes this very siloed way of working, whereas when we're novated to the developer to do the public realm, there's very often a kind of wall built between us and the client, so we can't have those conversations with the client, and then it becomes one then has to make a good relationship with the developer, and the developer is usually a contractor, a builder, in order to show them that we are kind of capable and able and sufficiently knowledgeable that we can deliver things within budget, we can bring them cost savings, we can meet all of the kind of policy agendas for the council in order that they trust us enough to allow us to do things where they don't see any value, like they don't see necessary, they have to do certain things, like they have to provide play and they have to provide a kind of urban greening factor, but they want to do it at the lowest common denominator, and trying to kind of explain to them that kind of integrating kind of play with nature-based urban greening, is value added, then becomes what the struggle is.
And we were also talking about friction. We were yesterday about friction, that normally like clients, is it be it the city or private clients, they tend to ask for frictionless solutions.
Yeah.
And what you do is not frictionless. So
No. Yeah, frictionless solutions like zero maintenance planting is always the good one. It's just like, I mean, we know that they know that's not possible, and it's a fantasy, and they want you to deliver the undeliverable. And also, I think they want to have someone that they can blame afterwards as well, because it will look brilliant on day one, and then you know it won't be sustained, and it's heartbreaking, and kind of arguing for the for lower capital sums and for more money to be taken out of the capital and put into maintenance. But then that becomes problematic because it's very difficult to ring fence it and to make sure that it's then spent on that and not taken for something else. And it kind of feels like at the moment, like do less, but do less better, like make things sparser, use more kind of robust, lower cost materials, and try and achieve all of your policy objectives of sustainability and urban greening. But keep it robust and kind of sustainable. But the things that are sustainable is like natural rocks, and so everything's going to end up looking like the Stone Age. I mean, it's just natural rocks and trees, so long as they go in when they're big. Otherwise, they'll just die. So it's
But I have two questions. One is you describe kind of work in a cognitive brief as being complicit, and then there's compromise, and there's basically added value. So my question would be, did the briefs change over the past 30 years? Part two, the short question, were there also such significant cuts for maintenance of those traditional green gardens, traditional London parks? Were you also affected by that?
I think to answer the second question first, I think the royal parks, the big parks, like Hyde Park, have a different funding structure, and then places like Hampstead Heath, which are an entirely different green space. I mean, its virtue is the fact that it's left to go wild, and to a certain extent the Lee Valley. And I think that has its own issues, because I think a lot of people who live in cities find that kind of nature kind of incredibly threatening and not somewhere that they want to hang out in. And then to go back to your first question about the briefs and have they changed, I think briefs have got, like the whole procurement practice in London has become much more regularised. And so you have kind of a pre-tender list where you have to tender to be on a list, and then people only tender to the people on the list, which is kind of good in some ways because you put a lot of effort in at the front, and then that you're not going to be in competition with 400 people, you're going to be in competition with 12 people or something. And briefs have become very rigorous, and they tend to ask the same questions, and they're all it's about EDI, it's about sustainability, it's about co-design, and everybody answers those questions the same because everyone goes to AI and feeds it in and gets the answer out, and so the scoring becomes incredibly tight between all the competitors, and then it sort of has swung completely the other way. It just comes down to personal taste, because if everyone's scoring and they're all scoring the same, and it comes down to personal taste, and it comes down to your economic score, because that's where the greatest difference can be. And so, big practices are able to undercut, which is, it's a tough time in London at the moment, as it is everywhere, I imagine, yeah.
But you survived already 30 years.
Yeah. Yes.
How did you do that?
By being bloody minded, I think, a lot of the time. By not wanting to compromise, and by wanting to go to work every day, which is, And also, I think both Liza and I would admit that probably no one else would employ us, so we had to make it work.
Has your understanding of public space changed in the last 30 years? Like, what Is there something you would do different today than you did it 30 years ago?
I think we're still doing exactly the same thing. We're just trying to do it better. I think we always started out with that idea of how can you make spaces that are not deterministic, that they don't say to people, this is what you can do here, this is who you have to be here. How can you make spaces that are open-ended and invite people to come in and to express themselves and take occupation, and the spaces that are sufficiently adaptable that people can kind of use them for their own purposes. And it's and the other thing we're really interested in is that sort of the interface between the public and the private. Like when you come out of your house into the world, you're still the same person as you were in your house, but you're subtly different because you're having to kind of interact, you're having to be social. And Cass Schonfield always used to describe public space as the kind of lived experience of democracy. That idea of kind of like that's a space where we have to get along with one another, but we also have to be allowed to have our differences. And I think that's what we're always trying to do in the designs that we make, is make that spaces that are sufficiently open-ended that people can kind of appropriate them on their own terms. So yeah, it takes a long time to do the thing you first thought of.
How do you deal with spaces that are in a way kind of changed beyond recognition, or when it's really sort of going, I guess, against the original design intent, or the project that you spoke to at the beginning, where the trees suddenly have sort of vanished from the public space scheme, or where that youth violence incident happened, and then do you then intervene? Do you then feel like you need to step in a way to kind of safeguard what the original intent was, or how do you kind of react to that in a way?
Well, with the White Hart Lane one, we did a lot of lobbying with the council on a number of fronts. One was to kind of explain that, like, without the planting, the rain gardens weren't functioning. So they'd invested all that money and they weren't doing the thing that they'd originally intended that they should do. And similarly, like, they needed to maintain them as well. And then we also kind of, repeated that sense of, like, the rain gardens are not responsible for youth violence. That's a completely different issue, but because we're humans and we want to have cause and effect, or we want to be able to be seen to be doing something, that to kind of perform concern by taking all the planting out, and to just be able to talk about that and say that's a completely separate issue. And we did spend a lot of time talking with the council about that, and finally I heard last week that they found money to reinstate the planting. And so kind of uninvited, we then barged in again with suggestions on how they could plant them to make it lower maintenance, and how they could have a different soil, how they needed to take the soil out because it was full of a weed seed bank, and they needed to take the silt out. So so that was kind of unsolicited design. So that sense of like a scheme is never finished. Like, you continually have to go back, and if you have the energy to kind of reinvest your design intent back into it. And with the Barking one, it was really difficult because they have no money. They have the housing that was built was very low cost housing. It was social housing, and because there's a housing crisis, it's full of, they're 1-bedroom flats with, like, families living in them, and so the kind of the public realm is incredibly heavily used, and has suffered as a result. And so how you can go back and kind of all you can do is make suggestions about how they can improve it. And I think in a way that's why we designed the stage the way that we did, is that we put in informal seating that we knew they wouldn't be able to take out. But we designed Barking Town Square when we were relatively inexperienced, and I think we learnt a lot since then. We learnt that kind of like how everybody hates benches because people sit on them, but then people want to sit down, so you have to make things that don't look like benches, so you make opportunities for people to sit down so they can't be taken away.
Thanks a lot. I would like to hear a little bit about the combination or also collaboration between the disciplines of art and architecture in your practice. How did that unfold, or how does it come from like separate backgrounds of you personally, or did everyone become an art kind of in between over all the years?
I trained as an artist, and Liza went to architecture school with Juliet, and I met Liza when I was the technician at the Architectural Association, and she was teaching there, and I think we just met in the bar and we just started talking, and she had been really interested in conceptual art, and she was really interested in the idea of kind of the question, can an architect kind of have a moral practice, because one always has a client, and because architecture is so expensive, and you're kind of always held within a kind of system that's outside of your control. And she kind of came to the conclusion that you couldn't, that she was going to try and be moral. And I think as an artist you come from a very different perspective. You don't have a client, you're able to do things speculatively, you're able to take risks, and I think that we enjoyed that kind of conversation, because I was always really interested in what it meant to work outside the gallery and to try and hold oneself outside of that kind of commercialization of art. And so I think that kind of overlap of interest between us was what sort of stimulated those early conversations, and we just kind of fell into practice from there, because we enjoyed the conversations we were having.
And after 30 years?
We argued massively at the beginning, and we still argue massively now, but we still enjoy each other's way of thinking that keeps us together. We enjoy, like, to have a practice where it is adversarial a lot of the time, because we're working in the public realm and we're working in really difficult situations, and to have somebody that you can share that kind of frustration with because they really understand it is delightful. You know, she was saying, she went to a lecture the other day, I think it was 6A or someone, and they were saying how they always kind of really sought to understand kind of, the deep needs and feelings and thoughts of their clients. And she was saying, yeah, we do that, but we just do it with the end user, not the client, and that's our problem.
Have there been moments where you felt that the best decision would to not build something, and how did you manage with this decision?
Very often one feels that. One feels like architecture isn't the answer. It's like the brief is addressing an issue where design is not the answer. Like, I mean, particularly, although it's slightly tangential with the White Hart Lane example, the kind of youth violence issue wasn't produced by the rain gardens. It was produced by a lack of investment in kind of facilities for young people and for kind of making space for young people. And like, very often, there was another project we did which was called Making Space in Dalston, where Dalston was a neighbourhood where there was very little green space, and the proposal was to kind of demolish some of the housing and make a park. And kind of Liza led on that project, and she came into that project saying kind of, no, just let's look at all of the available green space that's there but is not being used, and how can we consolidate that and make that into a park. And in the end they found a disused, through research they came to understand that the disused railway line, which was used for fly tipping, was actually illegally squatted and could be brought back into public ownership, and then that became a park, that became the Eastern Curve Garden, which is an incredibly successful green space now. So I think that sense of, it's not necessarily that building something or making something isn't the answer, but it's like the way to answer the question can be more tangential, and that's where you kind of like, by talking to people and by kind of that close looking and by embedding yourself in the community and opening up the team to other voices, you really understand what the issues are in a neighbourhood and what it is that people value.
Could you very quickly describe the pedestrianisation of Oxford Street and the international collaboration, and given it being such a high-profile, extensive piece of work, why did you not succeed?
Well, the response we got to our submission is that our bid read more like advocacy rather than a methodology, and I think that is probably very typical, is that we came in with a kind of series of propositions about not necessarily how we would deliver on the brief, but how the brief could be shaped to make the outcome better, possibly. And the pedestrianisation of Oxford Street is a highly kind of political project. It's not necessarily a design project.
Does anyone have a question? Any more?
Maybe just quickly, this kind of ratio between political and design, because I mean, all of your projects have been full of friction. I mean, you started with Thatcher saying, what did she say, society is dead or doesn't exist
Yeah, there's
anymore?
no such thing as society.
There's no such thing as society. And I mean, 30 years on, London still exists as a city and with a society in it, and not just there, everywhere. I don't know, just to me, this kind of the relationship between how much is political work and how much is design work, and how do they merge? This is one thing of like, and this kind of need for friction, it seems, right? I mean, every project that you described was full of kind of issues that the things had, and you had to somehow bend it. I will follow with something else. I will leave you quickly.
Yeah, I think all of us, when we came together, came from a kind of second wave feminist perspective, where we kind of really understood the personal as political, and so I think that was the kind of baseline that we approached every project with, was to kind of deliberately think about kind of who's not in the room, who are these proposals excluding. If this is public space, who's not being invited into this environment? And kind of, like I said, architecture and public realm design is an expensive thing, and so very often it's shaped in order to kind of bring in more money. But what's the expense of that? Like who's then displaced? And so that the Hackney Wick project, the Art Camp project, was, like I say, it was a kind of it should be in Jess Ferney's doomed projects compendium, because it was about those children having that experience that they would never have had we not kind of socially engineered it for them. And that sense of kind of recognising what you're losing, and I think even just making space to show it and to name it is a way of kind of having a resistance to that, like you say, that kind of seamless rolling out of a public realm that doesn't allow for friction.
Maybe in a follow-up way, in a weird kind of way, do you think you would work completely differently if the trajectory of, let's say, the political development would have gone the other way? I mean, you spoke about the beauty of this city and that you arrived. We're facing quite different issues here than in London. Do you think in a way this even would stay the same?
Well, we started the practice kind of just a few years before Tony Blair was elected. And that was a moment of immense optimism. And there was, you know, that government invested hugely in young people. And that was really, really noticeable. And that optimism, that sense that you were building a future for a future generation was really apparent. And that kind of galvanised us. And I think we were very lucky that we were practicing at that time, because it gave us the opportunity to explore those ideas and to feel that those ideas were worth exploring. I mean, briefs were still kind of like very conservative. I mean, I remember we had a brief that asked us to make a series of sculptured flagstones to guide the intrepid tourists through Hochschule, which was a kind of up-and-coming groovy area. And I think we ended up spending the money on planting some roses in a school yard that came through the fence, so that they made the pavement side of the fence really pretty as well. So that idea of kind of borrowed pleasure, of kind of enhancing someone's environment, and it gives pleasure to someone else rather than having sculptured flagstones. But yeah, you know, everything is political, and it's just how you negotiate it. And I think that thing of kind of staying in the room long enough that you can have those conversations and that you can make trust, and you know, that was what we learned early on, that you can't just come in kind of raging and righteous. You have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be able to deliver as well.
Thank you. Could we meet maybe at the elephant bar? There's some pizza coming.
The bar sounds lovely, yes.
I'll interrupt you just maybe in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So if there are not any questions anymore, does anyone have a question? So if there are no questions, we would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your lecture, and also thank you for the audience for the interesting questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.